And obviously at some point, if people keep on saying, well, I can make it whatever I want, then at some point it departs from what is NLP, and it's something, but it's not NLP anymore. And there's certainly lots of trainers who've done that. For example, Tony Robbins, who takes an essence of NLP, takes it in a different direction. At what point does it stop becoming teaching NLP, and then you've got to call it something else? So I think, yeah, that process of evolving, as you've all said or hinted at, the learner's context is changing. The learner's ability to understand and define the subject is changing. And at first, with very little context, it's easier for the learner just to follow a recipe. So you start with your first cookery book, and it gives you the ingredients, tells you how to combine the ingredients. That's it. You can produce that recipe, and you can produce that recipe over and over again. And then as your understanding of not what you're doing or the right way to do something, the right way to follow the recipe, but as your understanding of why you're doing the things that you're doing. So some of you will have heard me talk about getting a bread maker for the first time, and me being me, wanted to experiment with the ingredients. So he comes with a recipe book, and it says you've got to put this much flour, this much water, this much yeast, and sugar, and so on, all these different ingredients. And so I wanted to experiment with it to see why, what are the factors, because what was happening was I could follow the recipe exactly the same way every time, but the bread wouldn't come out the same way every time. The recipe and the method was identical. The bread was different. And I wanted to understand what is making the bread come out this way or that way. So I experimented with the recipe, and I found there are certain things that you have to do them as per the recipe says. And there are other things you can change. For example, you have to put the yeast in. If you don't put the yeast in, you get something that looks like a house brick. If you forget to put the salt in, it looks like bread, but it doesn't taste right. So there are certain things that have to happen, and certain things that there's some flexibility. And then I got my second bread maker probably about 5 years ago, which is a Panasonic, and the recipe book that comes with the new bread maker doesn't only give you the recipe, it tells you that first page in the book is a picture of all the ingredients of bread, and it tells you what each one does. So it's telling you the purpose, the reason why you're putting that ingredient in. And once you know why you're putting it in and what it's doing, then you can start to improvise more. So the bread that I produce now is much more consistent, although the recipe changes, which is really interesting. We follow a consistent recipe, we don't get consistent results. We change the recipe, we get consistent results. Does that remind you of using particularly practitioner techniques? Or we can say, well, I did the swish exactly as it tells me to do it in the book, but the person is still having this reaction that they talked about. How can that be? How can we explain that when the recipe was perfect?